Hello, and welcome to How Books Are Made, a podcast about the art and science of making books. I'm Arthur Atwell. Great publishing is all about collaboration. So you have to be lucky enough to meet the right person at the right time. And if I hadn't met Julia Norrish 9 years ago, Book Dash would not have given away 4.5 million books to children. This is a special episode. This month, the team at Book Dash is saying goodbye to Julia after an incredible tenure as its executive director. She is one of the most talented, insightful, and dedicated people I have worked with. So, today we are going to celebrate our time working together by talking about the most fun we've ever had in publishing. That is, how Book Dash makes gorgeous new children's books in just 12 hours and then gives them away. And how our method might just be catching on all over the world. Julia, what a pleasure to talk to you today. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. I'm privileged to be invited.
It's a big time for Book Dash. It's been 10 years since Book Dash began. And about 8 years ago, it became your little baby bird to feed when it barely had feathers. And now it's grown and grown into this big, strong, beautiful bird. I don't know, stork, perhaps, delivering books all over the country. And now it's time for your next adventure because you're about to leave Book Dash after an amazingly successful 8 years. What does it feel like to be wrapping up?
Yeah, I love that image of Book Dash as a stork delivering books to all across the country. It's incredible. One of the things we try and do is get books to children from birth, really. So it's a great analogy and one that maybe some other people in the communication department will run with. For me, wrapping up, it feels very strange. Yeah, it's about 3 weeks, quite literally, until my last full day. The fact that I can see those on a calendar is what's really making it hit home now. I think part of why Book Dash has been successful is we plan meticulously, annually, monthly, weekly, daily, that kind of thing. And so now there are a few hours left in my calendar over the next 3 weeks. I know exactly what's going to happen and what needs to be done between now and the end.
Wow.
And it's a bizarre feeling because I think previously I would have always thought, okay, well, if we don't get to it in October, there'll be November or December, or we'll move it to next quarter, or is this a next year problem? And now it might be a next year problem for Book Dash, but it's not mine. I am sitting in an interesting position. It's the first time I'm leaving a job. The backstory is that you actually hired me about 9 years ago to be an intern. Yeah, so wrapping up any job is not something I've done before. The fact that I think Book Dash captivated me and kind of held my attention for so long is testament to what a fantastic project it is. It's got a long and bright future ahead of it, I know. But for me to be stepping away, I'm trying to do that in the same way that I led, kind of gracefully and thoughtfully. But it's not an easy position. And I've got to get okay with the fact that some things are not going to get finished and I'm going to have to pass them on.
Yeah, I can't even imagine it. Well, it's been an absolute privilege to work with you. I'm sure our paths will continue to cross often going forward. For those who don't know Book Dash, when you have a minute to tell someone what Book Dash is, how do you describe it?
It does depend on who the person is, where I am, if we're in a funding pitch or over a braai. But usually it will contain the following. It will be something around Book Dash is a social impact publisher. That's really easy for people to understand. We put purpose and impact and books in children's hands over profit. We started with a vision of every child owning 100 books by the age of 5. That also gets people on board quite easily. They think, well, why not? But how publishing has often been done and how we've inherited it from a lot of different contexts means that it's really expensive and we're publishing for a small market and it's not often creating books that are relevant for all children and all families to enjoy and access. And so Book Dash redesigned and reimagined key parts in the publishing process, mostly how we make the books and then how we get them to children at scale. The kind of results of that are a 12-hour publishing process, super fast-paced, done with volunteer, highly skilled creatives that Book Dash facilitates. and then massive print runs that are incredibly efficient, sending books to partner organizations around the country and around the world, given the open license nature of what we do. It usually starts something like that, and then it will go on. And I think Book Dash, it's a simple concept, but it's quite complex in terms of how it's structured and really thoughtfully set up. You can emphasize different aspects of what we do depending on who you're talking to and what's going to ignite them. I could spend hours talking just about the open license and how it's set up, but also how it's used and the impact it has in the world. Some people are much more interested in the book creation, which I think is what we're going to talk about or focus on now.
And I think when you first joined Book Dash, when it was really just the very beginnings of what it would become, we'd probably given away maybe a couple of thousand books at most. And where are we now? How many books are now in the world?
That we know of, which is getting harder and harder to know and track, but about 4.8 million books in the world. About 4.5 have been printed by Book Dash and the remainder by organizations around the country. Just in June this year, we printed 610,000 books in one go. So all in one print run, which, as you say, it just makes those early print runs of 4,000, 10,000, even 50,000 look important for where we were at the time, but really quite minuscule.
It's just fantastic. As you say, we're going to talk about the making of the books. You, of course, have been doing much more than just make books. You've been overseeing enormous distribution and literacy projects, managing people and raising funds. If we're going to zoom in on the book-making part, we should first explain what a Book Dash Day is. The organization gets its name from the way the books are made. And I thought perhaps what we could do is we tag team this and describe what happens on the day. But what is the point of the day? What are we trying to achieve on a Book Dash Day?
We are trying to make usually 10 brand new open license African storybooks in one day. And for anyone that has an inkling of how books are made, it sounds either like magic or like craziness, and it's probably somewhere in between. I suppose if we were to tell the story of the run up to the day, and then we can start from people arriving. But about 2 months before a Book Dash event, we publicize it. At the moment, we host them in South Africa. People around the world, that's also an openly licensed or kind of openly documented and replicable model. Anyone can go online, get our manual, and host Book Dash type events around the world. And they have been done in Laos and Cambodia and France and Namibia and Angola and Luxembourg, and just quite incredible. We advertise, we're calling for writers, illustrators, and designers and editors. Those are the 4 really skills that you need to make a beautiful children's book. And we call for people, they apply. There's quite a grueling review process where we check if someone can really stand up to the challenge of making a book in one day. Then we match teams together. We've got 10 writers, 10 illustrators, 10 designers, and 4 editors. We, as Book Dash, as the publisher, even though we open license the material, there's still a publisher. I think that's a useful thing. Sometimes people think that role kind of falls away, but you still need someone to hold the process together. We match the writer, illustrator, designer in teams. And so before the day, they know who they're going to be working with, and they have an inkling of the story that they're going to bring to life on the day. That's the process in the run-up before the event. And as you said, the goal is to end that day with 10 brand new African storybooks in the world that we didn't have that morning.
It's a very exciting thing to be part of.
But do people know your role in Book Dash? I'm just curious because it might sound like you're talking to someone who knows more than you. And in some ways, I think I was working out the other day that I think I have been at the most Book Dash events of anyone, I suppose, in the world, because no one else has been doing them so much as Book Dash itself. I think I worked out it's 18 or 19 events that I've really been so lucky to see unfold and to kind of play an overarching role in. But you also do know a thing or two about the process and how it started. In fact, I think you might have had a hand in designing the day.
A little hand, yeah. No, I am one of the 3 co-founders of Book Dash and developed the early ideas for how the books would be made on the day and what the big vision would be. And then you and the team at Book Dash have really helped that fly. Today, I am on the board of Book Dash. It's always an absolute pleasure to be part of its work. And it's certainly the most fun you can have in publishing, being at one of these Book Dash days. So yeah, let's tag team and describe what happens on the day. We'll go kind of hour by hour. What's going on? You want to kick us off? What's happening? It's 8:00 in the morning.
Sure. So the facilitation team have been there since about 6:37, depending on how much of the setup. We've set up the venue the day before. I think in order to achieve something as ambitious as making 10 books in one day and not compromising on quality, you have to make the environment incredibly conducive. So it's a beautiful big space. We've got colorful banners of Book Dash illustrations up and around. There's bunting, and the bunting has been a kind of Book Dash signature since day one. It feels like a children's party when you walk in. And that's what the facilitation team have been doing up until 8. And then at around 8, the creative teams start arriving. Pretty much all of our Book Dash events, except during COVID, are in person. We go to the creatives and we go to areas of the country where there is enough density of creatives that we can get the quality and the number of people that we need in the room. And they start arriving. There's like a bit of chatter. They get to introduce their team. They work out, where they're sitting and where's their home for the day, and get to know the facilitators. And I think what's quite exceptional about, and it's also something we look for in the selection process, is the personality, not just the skill set. The personality of the people needs to be such that they can arrive at 8 o'clock in the morning and by 9 have met the facilitators who are going to be their project managers, kind of checking in on them and have some kind of respect for them, and have met their team and their editor and be willing to now collaborate with these people who they've known for less than an hour. And not everyone can do that. You need to have a really open and flexible and kind of, I suppose, warm personality. And I think that's a big part of what makes Book Dashes work, but also makes people come back time and time again. So there's real nice food and breakfast and delicious things, and there's a conducive, colorful, warm atmosphere, and there are all these incredible people in the room. And that's kind of happening between 8 and 9. And the facilitators are rushing around, making sure everyone knows who they are, who they're working with, where they should be. The other thing that does happen is that people need to bring all of their own equipment. So if we're painting the picture, you kind of starting with something that looks like a children's party venue, or even somewhere between a children's party and a wedding venue. There are kind of tables with team numbers on and stationery and all the things that you might need to make a book, except because we're working with professionals, they have their own equipment, and we tell people very carefully, use what you're most familiar with, because it's already a massive challenge to do all of this in one day. So don't experiment with a new program. Don't decide that you're going to do watercolor if you normally illustrate digitally, that kind of thing. So often people bring their full Mac setups, screen, tower, keyboard, Wacom tablets, whatever it is. So all of this incredibly beautiful equipment is making its way into the venue as well. It does really hard work on the day. And so slowly the room is filling up with the people and the tools that we'll need to do this.
Okay, so it's 9 o'clock and the briefings have to begin, right? Because people know they're going to make a book in a day. They have an inkling of maybe the story that they're going to be creating, but we need to hold them together as facilitators. We got to make sure they each know exactly what their jobs are on the day. We've also got to prepare them for the process of collaboration. For example, the writers have come with a story. They've already got a vision in their minds of what that story is going to be, but they're about to work with editors who are inevitably going to tweak and change the story or the wording or both. They're going to work with illustrators who are going to have a different vision. And suddenly, the characters you had in your mind are completely different under the pen of the illustrator. And so the writers will go off with one facilitator and have a conversation about what they're going to do, what they're responsible for in the day. The illustrators will go off with a different facilitator and get a whole lot of information about how the day is going to go. They're going to be prepared for the fact that they're going to work harder than anyone else on the day, because they're going to have to produce pretty much one finished illustration every 40 minutes, which is kind of extraordinary. The editors need to be briefed on how they are going to help the teams, particularly the writers, but really the whole team, do their best work given the constraints of the day. And the editors also are going to have to be coaches and therapists through this process, which can be pretty grueling. We'll get to the designer briefing in a moment, but have I got that lay of the briefing land pretty much there?
Yeah, I think that's where we can get really technical, because now you've separated, you've painted the picture in the welcome of what needs to be achieved, and you've kind of given the whole group a pep talk. And now it's like, okay, how many DPI does your illustration need to be set at?
Right.
Like, what software can we work with? And you need to export in how to size your spread. Do we have a style sheet or style guide for how we write things with the writers? And the editors want to know exactly what do they do when, what is their role, how much say do they have? So as you said, that's if you're like a publishing geek, then it's the fun part, because you've kind of getting into the how, not just the what are we going to achieve. As we've gotten further, with Book Dash, we've got 211 books in our catalog now. So over 23 events, we've made 211 titles, which is just wonderful. And so we've got more and more examples of what works really well. So when we're talking to the illustrator designer kind of combo, we've combined those two to get the same briefing. It's focused on the illustrations, not the technical design stuff, but it's so that the designer understands what the illustrator has been told and kind of has line of sight into that. But we really talk there about how they can collaborate. And we've got fantastic examples of where an illustrator created the elements of a spread, but the designer pulls it all together and kind of works with almost puppets and creates the background and creates the kind of common thread so that the illustrator, as you said, can move on to more elements for the next spread in the next 40 minutes, which fly by. So yeah, it's a lot about practically how are we going to do this.
Of course, time moves quickly, and now we're at 10 o'clock, and the teams are pretty much focused on flat planning. Can you tell us what is flat planning? What's on the plan?
Flat planning is a beautiful thing where everyone's got an idea in their head. As you said, the writer thinks that they know how it's going to go. They're getting told often that it's actually not their story anymore. And we particularly call people writers and not authors from the beginning so that we kind of reduce that expectation that I'm the author and I'll brief the illustrator of what this book's going to look like. And so flat planning is really where, as the director of Book Dash would say, is where the tacky hits the tar, because now we have to agree on what's the collective vision that this team has for the book. And it's physically, a flat plan is we work with an A3 piece of paper. It's similar to kind of storyboarding. If you're working in film, you're mapping out what is going to go on each page. You've got a little square for the cover, and you've got a square for the back cover, and you've got double page squares to represent the spreads that go in between. All Book Dash books, one of the keys, and I suppose if we're talking about how books are made, it's one of the founding, I don't know if say innovations, but really, really important and insightful thing that was done at the beginning. They're all the same size, same extent or length, same number of pages. So that helps the teams. They all know they've got 12 2 pages alongside each other, 12 double page spreads to tell the story. It helps keep it simple. It helps keep it age appropriate because we're making books for under fives, read aloud storybooks. But it also makes the print runs super efficient because they can all scheme up together. But anyway, that's just to say that everyone is flat planning on the same parameters, and they have to fit their story into 12 moments, and they have to agree on what those moments are, how the story unfolds, where's the kind of climax, where's the denouement, or whatever you want to call it, and how do we tell that visually. So the facilitators are helping the teams flat plan, providing advice, guidance, especially from our kind of expertise, but we are also, after that process, going around and checking that the flat plans are complete. And by complete, we mean we know what illustration, and there's a small sketch of that illustration, and what words, roughly, or where the text at least is going to go, but what part of the story is going on each spread, and that all 12 spreads have that, because that's essential. It becomes their roadmap for the day. And if that flat plan is not complete, and if everyone doesn't agree on it, then throughout the day, you're just going to hit roadblocks all the time.
Yeah, it's amazing to see everyone realize just how much work they're doing in that 1 hour while they flat plan, and then they can execute. Then at some stage, we extract the designers because they need an extra long briefing. So it's 11 o'clock in the morning. We've extracted the designers from their groups and put them in a room in front of a big screen. And the design facilitator takes the designers through a pretty much 40-minute briefing on the technicalities of creating a book. Many of the designers on the day are actually book designers. They know about how to use InDesign and how to package files and how to set up bleed and trim and how to manage colors and layers in InDesign. But for those who don't, we have to do a pretty swift crash course in the book-specific features of InDesign and of creating books. We're using InDesign because pretty much every designer there is familiar with it, and it's the predominant tool for bookmaking. And in that technical briefing, we cover an enormous amount of detail that I find really fun as a publishing geek, from color profiles to resolutions and sizes and all kinds of other little details. And usually designers get quite excited about that by the end of it.
I'm still jealous. I've never sat in on a full technical designer briefing because often, if we just think about facilitation as well, there's usually, as you said, a design tech director who's really familiar with the software and the tools and can give that briefing and help the designers throughout the day, and the illustrators with the software. There's usually a facilitator who's kind of in charge of the words, the writers and the editors, the kind of mother hen to them. And then there's a kind of general jack of all trades facilitator. And that's usually the role in fact, I think that's almost always the role I've been playing. So that person pretty much stays in the main venue the whole time to kind of firefight as things come up. Because while the designers are away, the illustrators are getting going. They have to, by the time the designer gets back, there should be 1.5, almost 2 illustrations complete, depending on how long the designer briefing takes. So it's not like this is happening and nothing else, because I think the thing about a book dash day is there's always multiple things happening at a time. But because it's so well planned, things aren't overlapping that shouldn't, or they aren't kind of crashing into each other.
Usually the illustrator has had to pick one spread that the team is pretty sure is not going to change during the editing process. And so that's what they're getting on with. Because another thing that's happening in parallel is the editing. Let's talk about 12 o'clock. The writers and the editors are really getting stuck in. What's happening in that process?
What Book Dash is it's basically publishing with all the, and this is your kind of term, Arthur, like air squeezed out of it. But you can't squeeze out editing. Everyone needs an editor. So the editors are there. They're working with, depending on their kind of workload, how much editing we think the stories might need, and their kind of expertise. They're working with between 3 or 4 teams. So they need to make sure that they're going around to each of the writers and at some point having one-on-one, kind of leaving the main venue or finding a quiet spot, going through the story, getting a sense of the writer's vision. So early in the day, you're looking at more kind of developmental editing, story development. How is this really the best way to tell this story? And that's the kind of discussions that the editors might have with their writers at that point. As you said, things are able to change. And that's another different part about Book Dash, is that by the time the illustrator gets the story, traditionally, in a kind of more linear publishing process, the story is final and it has often been edited as well. So the illustrator is really working to brief. The illustrator, in this case, can have a say in how the story gets told visually, which I think is really appealing. But they also have to be able to know that the story might change throughout the day. Hopefully not too many times, otherwise the illustrators will all mutiny and leave. When we look for editors, I think that's another important thing, is that we're not just looking for text editors. We're looking for someone who can see a story and can get involved in story editing and development, as well as then cares about where commas should go and whether we're allowed to use dashes or not. But that comes later, and it does come. I think we're going to talk about the writer's read-through next. But basically, the editors need to get the writers ready for that writer's read-through, which happens after lunch, that the story is pretty much final by lunchtime, also so that the rest, the visual part of the team, can get on with it.
Yeah, we've got to about 12:30, 1 o'clock. So let's say we're at 1 o'clock now, and we now extract all the writers from their teams. Usually this is somewhere coinciding with lunch, right? People are actually eating through the day. Healthy, energy and protein-rich food is coming out. We're trying to keep people off the sugar because we need them to last for a lot longer. And we drag everyone away from lunch, well, the writers in particular, and we put them in a circle for the writer's read-through. And this is definitely one of the really magical moments. I've been lucky to facilitate a number of writers' read-throughs. We like to emphasize to the writers that because their books will be read aloud to children by caregivers, parents and older siblings and teachers, we really want to be kind to those people and make sure that this is a book that's fun to read, not just lovely for the child to listen to, but is a pleasure to read. And in order to really make the most of that, you have to read it out aloud to yourself as you write it. You've got to hear what it sounds like. What does it feel like to say these words? And that all comes together in the read-through when the writers have to read their stories to all the other writers, which is very nerve-wracking, and get feedback. How does it sound? It's always nerve-wracking as a facilitator going in because you have really no idea how the writing team will manage to find a line where they can be constructive and help writers improve their stories, but be warm and encouraging and make sure everyone is happy to be there and happy to have their story commented on. And it amazes me every time how well these people pull that off. And we've seen incredible things. I mean, one of the stalwarts of Book Dash Days, who's come back many times, the screenwriter and author Sam Wilson, has a gift for tweaking the endings of stories that is just absolutely so special. And to see that happen is wonderful. And also just the warmth that people show to each other in those writers' read-throughs is really lovely.
I think what Book Dash has done really well from the beginning is paint a really clear picture of the vision. And if you can get people on board with that, then everyone's kind of yes, we need to make the best books we can possibly make in one day for the children and for the families and the early childhood development teachers who read them. And so then you're kind of open to feedback, and you're sensitive also about what feedback you're giving. I think something else we haven't quite touched on is there are some like celebs in the room, particularly if you're in the kind of writing, illustrating, design sector. And so sometimes it's someone you've really, really admired for a long time giving you a bit of advice on your story. And so it's kind of wonderful as well to be in a room and with the agreement that you could also give some input into their story if you have it. So it's this kind of massive equalizer, and at the same time so fun and so meaningful. I think that's how we get that balance going on.
Absolutely. One of the things that is difficult to get right with any book is the title. Somewhere between the writer's read-through and a little bit later, when we have to really say the story is done, we got to figure out the title. How does the title bash work?
The idea of the title bash is that the person who's been in the weeds the whole time, the writer and the editor, is able to bring what their idea for the title is or a few ideas and then get input from people who are really interested and care about words, but also have a bit more perspective on their story. And so together, again, it's a kind of collaborative effort between the writer teams, the writers, the editors, and the facilitator, what to call these books that captures the essence of the story, kind of adds a little intrigue, makes the kid want to read it, and it's not just saying what the story is about. There's much more to a title than that. One of the things on the imprint page of Book Dash Books is it will say, written by, designed by, illustrated by, edited by. And then there's a very important line that comes after that and says, with the attendees or the participants of Book Dash number 10 or whatever it was in Joburg, because you cannot actually pinpoint who inputted everything when you're doing things in this nature. To give that kind of heads up or that nod to all of the participants for every book that was made on that day, I think is really important.
For sure. At this point, it's about 2:30 in the afternoon. Now the story is settled pretty much. From here, the writer's job is to keep the designer and the illustrator fueled emotionally and physically. But the editors still have a key job to do. They have to proofread these books, because when you stare at the words as the writer for this long, you're going to start not being able to see your own mistakes. And your own editor can't see your own mistakes at this point. And so at 3:00, the editors are trading each other's stories. So we've usually got one editor for every 2 or 3 teams, and an editor who hasn't seen a story at all now gets given the text to proofread, because we really want to make sure that we're giving the designers some clean, error-free text so that the books are as good as they can be.
Yeah, and the whole time the illustrators and designers are chipping away at their flat plan, if we remember that thing that we spoke about a few hours ago in this case. And often they're using the actual flat plan literally as their roadmap and ticking, spreads off as they go to help them stay motivated and have an idea of how on track they are. All the teams are given also an outline of the day and a progress kind of tracker. But we might come to it still. The facilitators, particularly that jack of all trades facilitator that I was talking about, is going around to each team to check that they're on track, finding that fine line between constructive feedback and being lovely and warm and like a cheerleader.
And that's one of the arts of facilitating these events, is knowing how teams are doing. Because you might say, okay, it's 3:00 in the afternoon. You're pretty much halfway through the productive hours of the day. Surely if the illustrator has to do 12 double-page spreads, they've done 6 illustrations now, right? Cool, you've done 6, tick, you're on track. But it's not that simple. What are you actually tracking, and how do you take into account that teams and illustrators work differently?
It's such an interesting question. We were just now, after our event in Joburg in August, reviewing the tracking tool. But like any tool, you need to be aware of it's designed to help you, but it's not going to do the job for you. You need to apply judgment. What the tool does allow us to do is broadly categorize illustrators into styles or approaches. Are they working complete spread by complete spread? And as you said, they can start anywhere in the 12 spreads, the one that's going to change the least. They might start at the end or in the middle, but essentially they're working on a spread, ticking it off, moving to a different spread, ticking it off. So in that case, yes, they might be, and they should be, around spread 6 halfway through the hours. Even then, it's not necessarily the case, because they tend to speed up massively at the end. They're now really familiar with these characters. They know the scenes. They kind of can draw them in different positions more easily. They get faster as they go. And they love to tell you that they're going to get faster as they go as well. So you need to also know, based on their work, if that's true or not, because you also don't want someone really rushing at the end. So we often do tell them, okay, it's good enough, move on. The magical little line, you can come back at the end if you have extra time. And then I think I've seen like 10 people in my whole like 18 events that actually had extra time to go and do all those details they wanted to. I think it's also really important to remind people of the audience. These are young children, often children who are not particularly familiar with books or kind of print material at all, or even like visual representations of things. So it doesn't need to be to your standard when you have 3 days and are just producing one poster. It just needs to capture the essence. The other kind of general approach is that people work with in elements. They create a lot of different elements that are almost, as I said, like puppets that can be placed here and there. Maybe, like an expression, a facial expression adjusted, or an arm adjusted to make it make sense with that spread. But they're basically building up characters and elements. And that's much more difficult to track because it's not so like, oh, well, you should be halfway and like you should have done 6 spreads. So there it really takes publishing kind of expertise and judgment to say, okay, I can see how those characters are going to help you build 3 or 4 spreads. And then you start talking to the designer as well and saying, okay, what do you actually have in your InDesign file and how built up is it? So the spreadsheet helps and it shows if things are green or red or behind or whatever, but it's one tool in the wheelhouse of the facilitator. I would say the main thing is get to know the team, put yourself in their position, see how they're working. Are they making significant progress at each 40-minute check-in? And if they're not making enough progress, then how can you help them?
Does it make a difference when the illustrator is working digitally or in physical media?
Massively. Digitally is so much faster. And I mean, obviously, as times have progressed, I think we've just seen more and more people work digitally. Now it's quite an exception if someone is working completely traditionally. Often people might line, do their line work traditionally and then scan it in or digitize that in some kind of vector program. But basically, when someone's working traditionally, they have to draw the full spread out every time. So you can't copy paste elements or grab, a background or a brush here and there. You have to create it from scratch every 40 minutes. And that's incredibly difficult for consistency and for speed. So while we do have quite a number of physically illustrated books in Book Dash category, a library, and they look gorgeous. Also, the software now is just incredible. The brushes that you can get that mimic traditional media is quite something. There are a few books in the catalog where someone would say, oh, that was definitely watercolor or gouache or pastel or what, and it's actually been completely digitally from the beginning. You're just much more flexible.
Yeah, it's wonderful to watch as well. So as a facilitator, you've been watching, you've been getting a sense of what's happening with the teams. And around 4:00, this thing happens that I think was originally the idea of one of my co-founders and my wife, Michelle, to have prize giving. And this is just wild. Can you tell us how prize giving works?
Yeah, it's one of those other things that makes it feel like more like a party than like if you take the productivity of a Book Dash day and you mapped it and you said everyone enjoyed doing it, like no one would believe you because it's just the insane amount of work that gets achieved, and yet everyone is smiling and having fun. And I think prize giving is one of those magic moments that also lifts the energy. There's about 3.5 hours left of working time for the teams. It's gotten into quite a focused space, actually. I think everyone's kind of found their groove, and the prize giving just kind of makes everything a bit silly again instead of focused on the deadline and we have to make a book or we're going to get fired or whatever it is. So the prize giving, what it does is it takes either who the people on the team are, if there's something funny, maybe they all start with the same letter, like the name, or something funny about the story, or it takes a hook that you can find for each team and it builds a prize around that. But the prizes have been pre-bought because we know who's going to be working on what team and we have an idea of the story draft. So we base it around that, or if there's a particular person that we want to call out for something. And everyone pauses for a little while. There's some illustrators who just refuse to stop and will keep looking at their screens and drawing while there's prizes. But it's also a moment to create a bit of a shared, a little bit of insight into what other people are working on, because apart from the writers, it's important also to remember that none of the teams know what the other team stories are about or how they're approaching it. They've barely had time to look up, let alone walk around the room. So suddenly there's a bit of intrigue also created when one team gets like Dalmatian ears as a prize, and it's usually things that people can wear or use on the day. So it also like lets off a bit of steam. It's like a collective sigh and kind of smile for the whole room, because it's easy to get really zoned in on your team and your book, and people can also be starting to feel a bit stressed at that point. Oh, I'm not going to finish. I'm not good enough. Like, why was I selected for this? And it just really changes the dynamic, and everyone's smiling and wearing silly hats or playing like finger pool or something on their team. So that's probably how it works. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's also a lot of fun to do the prize shopping before the event and try and think what might elicit some joy.
It gets super zany, super fun. Often that's the moment a lot of photos find their way onto social media from the event, because everyone's getting a little silly together. The work is still really going though. And as you say, people are starting to feel a little stressed. They're going to start flagging. Their energy levels are a little bit low. It's about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we can finally let them have some sugar. Chocolate starts arriving on all the tables. And pretty soon after that, for those who want it, some wine, some beer for those who like to loosen up that way. And then things get really jovial and fun. Of course, that jovial, fun energy is happening around the illustrators who are sitting with their heads down, absolutely cruising at this time and working really, really hard. And I think that energy, I like to think, is important for the illustrators, even though they're not participating necessarily. They're probably drawing on it.
Literally, yes. Yeah, no, I think so. And I mean, it's such a personality dependent thing. Some people really, really, really want a glass of wine, but they're going to save it till they finish. Some people are like, no, I need that to finish. Some people have finished 3 slabs of chocolate, or, it's whatever is going to help. We like to cater for whatever people need. The music is also going up by this stage, not hugely loudly, but just like ramping up the energy. There's a playlist for Whole Book Dash Day. There's also one that comes into play in the last few hours. It's got a little bit more upbeat, and often the words will be around finishing things as well, or getting to the final stages of things. So definitely, I think the illustrators, again, because they've come with a good intention, to be fair, their role is almost done, and the designers are kind of getting there ready, waiting, because there's some stuff that the designer can only do once that final illustration is in. So the designers really take things home.
Absolutely, because let's say it's now 6 o'clock. As you say, illustrators pretty much coming to the end. The designers are doing their thing. One of the things the designers are working on, or have been trying to work on this whole time, is the cover. We've also got to brief them in that early briefing stage on what they can do on the cover as opposed to inside, what to use and what to avoid. Covers can be pretty stressful as well for the designers. They have a lot to do. How do you find designers handle that?
I think they enjoy it a bit because there is a little bit more. So if something you were talking about is inside, the text can only be pure black. There's a kind of reason for that comes later in the printing, and it makes it much more efficient and more cost efficient as well. But on the cover, they can go a little bit more wild. They can also veer a bit off from the list of fonts that we provide that must be used in the interior for a number of reasons. Often the illustrator thinks that they're going to do a dedicated illustration for the cover, which is also quite fun to let them think that for a bit, or to try and tell them that's not going to happen. So we'll always also tell the designer, have a second option for the cover just ready, so that if the illustrator doesn't get to their drawing, you have a really good one. But sometimes it's the final illustration that's waiting for the cover. And so I think that's the thing. It's like everything in a book dash is kind of happening just in time. So there's just enough time for once that final illustration is done. If that is the cover image, pop it in, have everything else ready. Again, that's a principle for everyone. And I think it's a great principle for productivity in general. Like, if you're waiting for your colleague to give you a piece of information for your proposal, make sure the rest of it's ready so that when you get that, you can move. I think the covers are where the designers have a little fun, and it's really what can be their signature for the book, because sometimes it's a bit hard to tell who did what, and they could really take ownership of that cover.
Another little piece of the book that the designers get to take charge of is what we call the end papers. It's a slight misuse of a technical traditional publishing term, but they're essentially the color spreads at the beginning and end of the book that kind of frame the book. How do designers tackle that?
Oh, it's so fun. They love that. The idea of an end paper, it communicates a whole lot, but it doesn't have text on it or anything. And you basically pick, either it's like a very simple scene. We've got beautiful ones of like a kind of rolling hills and clouds. I love those. Like, it's just one scene. It's clearly not part of the story, but it's still giving you such a sense of what to expect. or it's like an element or a couple elements that are created into a repeat pattern. There's also a chance for such creativity of like, we make meaning by repeating things or by stopping that repetition, right? So to give the children and the people reading the books the opportunity to spot what's out of place or what's different and what does that mean. I think the designers get really keen on that. How do they do that without overdoing it?
Yeah, it's fantastic creativity that those designers bring. We've got to 7 o'clock and there's this incredibly boring task to do called packaging the files. And I won't spend much time on it. Packaging the files is essentially the job of making sure that we have everything, because once this team disbands at the end of the day, we need all of their files as Book Dash so that we can prepare the book for printing and put it on our website for other people to reuse. And packaging the files is a specific process, one runs in InDesign, that gathers together all of the images, all of the fonts, any particular plugins the designer might have used, all in one big zip folder, so that the designer can hand over that zip folder on a little flash drive, which we gave to each team at the beginning of the day. And that flash drive has to be handed to the technical director to say, everything's on here, everything this book needs, it's good to go. And that can be huge. That could be 3-4 gigabytes of data, illustrations and layouts and so on. But it's absolutely critical. And it's amazing how long it takes. And at this point, the technical director is going from table to table, helping the designers with the packaging process and trying to get the books out of the teams, because everyone's doing the last minute thrashing, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to get that last little bit in.
To check that everything really is there is so essential, I think, because sometimes people think it's all there or they've packaged correctly, and you need to really make sure, as you said. And that's also the moment where those warrior machines can really struggle. The computers crash, and it's all happening between 7 and 8. The work, in essence, is done. But now, basically, what's happening is teams are passing that flash drive to the technical director. The tech director is checking that everything truly, really is on the flash drive and knitting together what is going to be called the show and tell PDF. And as teams finish, that the kind of handover of the flash drive, it's a bit like the relay of the Olympic torch sometimes. It's like this moment. It's a bit like popcorn going off. Like, teams are around the room and this team pops as they finish and that team pops and everyone just kind of can't help themselves. They kind of stand up and cheer.
And of course, we're coming to the culmination of the day. One of the things the technical director is also doing is gathering PDFs of each person's book that are ready for presenting, because it's show and tell time. What happens at show and tell?
Right. So everyone is finished. They gather in front of a big screen. Often there's a kind of small stage in a big venue as well. We dim the lights, and this is kind of like energy around, because again, like I said, very few people have had insight into what the other teams have been producing. The facilitators wrap things up, thank everyone for the effort, remind of the kind of purpose of the day, thank the sponsors if we need to. And then one by one, we invite the teams and the whole team to come up onto the stage or the kind of front area. We project their beautiful book in digital form. Still, some people think we print the books on the day too. It's like,
Nope.
First come see what we do on the day and then decide if you want to add more to it. But in digital form on a big screen projector, the cover and the full kind of story gets projected, and the writer reads their story to the rest of the room. Not only is it this incredibly affirming experience for the team to see with a bit of distance what they managed to achieve on the day, but the rest of the room gets 9 and 10, including their own bedtime stories kind of read to them. And it's just this magical experience because everyone in the room becomes that child who might get this book read to them in future. And it really reminds people of how it feels to have a story read to you, the magic of discovering new characters. What's going to happen? How does this end? The emotion often. It's a beautiful way to wrap up the day. And when that 10th story gets read, you kind of can't believe you've had 10 already.
Yeah.
But you're also kind of sad that there aren't another 10 more.
Absolutely. One of the things the facilitators explain to everybody is what's going to happen to their book next. We won't go into all of that now, but essentially the book will go through a series of final checks. It'll get an ISBN. The files will be uploaded onto the Book Dash website so that other people can reuse it. And they will then be available the next time Book Dash does a big print run. Obviously, as soon as those books get printed, we try to make sure that the team knows all about it.
Yeah, anytime we print someone's book or do a translation or know of someone else who's used and distributed the book in whatever format, in whatever language, in whatever country around the world, We tend to let the teams know in that moment, or otherwise in a kind of annual update where they can see the reach of their books. And some people, very prolific book dashers, will get, do like 9 or 10 updates on all the books that they've created.
One of the very special things as a book dash volunteer myself, I designed a few books in early book dashes, is that we get a live online dashboard of our particular books. So the little URL I can go to and I can see my books listed and where they've been distributed, how many copies are in the world, how they've been reused by other organizations around the world that we know of. And it's incredible to be able to come back years after you've done a book dash and see where your book has gone. So thank you for that innovation, Julia. It's an amazing thing for volunteers to see.
Yeah, I think everyone's a volunteer. They're giving their time and their talent for free, but the exchange, I think, is that they know the value of that, and it's really important, and that it keeps growing, keeps growing, because those books sit on our website and get picked up and reused. And we can't even capture even a glimpse of it on those dashboards. So it's just really a little insight or snippet of the impact that a day of one's time and passion can have.
Yeah. Somehow these teams of people who've usually never met before create these books that children really like. And something that surprised me is often the books that actually aren't my favorites end up being total hits. And I have to say, wow, I love seeing the diversity of children's books and what children love. Over your years, you've done a lot of thinking about what makes a great children's book. What are some of those key principles that you really love about it?
We also ask the distribution partners who receive the books which are the favorite stories, in the hopes that we can kind of learn which ones to print and which ones land best with the kids. And even when we do a print run of the same, say, 3 titles, and all the partners around the country got those 3 titles, there will be an even split around which one was loved the most by the actual organization, who are often experts in early childhood, and by the kids and families. So I think it's also quite comforting to know that in general, our books are hitting the high notes for what makes good children's books. But when we're briefing the writers, we do remind them, I think, of the age of the children. They're really, really young. Young children are just starting to understand the world around them. They're processing information at incredibly high rates. And so just remember to keep the story accessible for a child, whether that be putting it in their home environment or having characters that they know and that are familiar to them, and then some stretch like elements. If listeners haven't heard of the kind of idea, and this is true for all books, but particularly for children's books, particularly for children in low income, impoverished environments where they might not have seen a lot of the world, is that books are windows and mirrors. But when a child is very, very young, that mirror aspect is incredibly important, because they need to understand that this 2D representation of something actually stands for things in the real world. That's the crucial thing that is happening in a child's brain when they're interacting with books, because that lays the foundations for literacy, for letter knowledge, for numeracy, for kind of how maths works. And I think we don't necessarily go into that detail with the writers when we brief them, but it's incredibly important to make that link between the real world and the kind of conceptual, metaphorical world, or what we use as symbols, really. The other thing that's incredibly useful and important is emotions. I kind of touched on that earlier, to give children the opportunity, and the adults in their lives, the opportunity through a third-party tool like a book, to experience situations where they can talk about emotions, they can name the emotions, because often a child gets very frustrated if they are feeling something, and it's usually a very big feeling. They don't know what to call it. They can't describe it to an adult. Just because children can't decode the actual language and the letters on the page, these kind of black squiggly lines that they start to realize have meaning for people who know how to interpret them, they still take part in the story. A child can get so much from a written text, even when they can't read it for themselves. And then just like fun and beautiful images. For me, I think a little bit of humor and a lot of color and beauty is so important for a child to see and experience, especially if their lives might be quite mundane and drab and not necessarily full of color. A lot of the photos that we get back from partners, especially in the kind of healthcare hospital environments where a lot of our books get distributed to families, and in the home environments, the book kind of stands out. It's like jumps out at you as this like incredible density of color and joy and meaning and text and interactions, all held in a 15 by 15 square space. And so the power of what children's books can introduce into kids' lives, and what they can kind of give caregivers and parents permission to talk about and to enjoy with their kids. Life is hard, and it can be quite stressful to be a parent, especially in a low resource environment. To have it modeled that you can play with your kid and you can smile and laugh and sing songs, that can all be in the content of a children's book, but also the act of reading and sharing a book or story with a child is bigger than the book. You can extend that into your behavior and how you interact with your child as well.
Those of us who love books and no children don't need persuading. The incredible power that books have, especially in children's very, very early years. Still, sometimes it's important and necessary to document that power, get it written down in a scientific form. And we won't go into it here, but you have been part of the leadership of a massive multi-year project recently that wrote up and got to research a lot of this power. And we'll put some links in the show notes to some of the summaries of that research. And I'll really encourage our listener to go and have a look at that and have it close to hand next time you need to point out to a funder or a champion how important it is.
We've also pulled together all of the global research around that. So what you're referring to is like, a specific situation in the South African context. Did it improve children's outcomes? But globally, it's so well documented, and many countries around the world do have national or kind of provincial level book gifting programs because they know that it's an investment in their human capital, an investment in their society. We're following on from that, but it's not really been done in lower middle income countries before, and yet such a cost-effective, relatively simple way to invest in your country's potential.
Yeah. If you had to pick 3 highlights from your time at Book Dash, if I can put you on the spot, picking from 8 years of incredible diverse experience, what comes to mind?
I think my first Book Dash event, I remember it like it was yesterday, and I remember every moment of it because I was seeing it for the first time. That was in Durban in 2015, and I was kind of just observing, kind of editing one or two of the stories. It just all became real for me. And as a creative and as someone who loves both words and pictures and drawings, just to see that intensity of all of that times 10 in one day was wonderful. And I was a publishing novice at the time. So also to see the technical side of publishing, how it works, in what order, who does what, was really eye-opening. Yeah, another one has to be taking Book Dash to Bologna Children's Book Fair a few years ago. The Bologna Children's Book Fair is an international trade fair for children's books. Halls and halls of children's books, and talks about children's books and illustrators and publishers, and just wonderful overwhelm. And I was lucky enough to go 1 year through the Department of Trade and Industry as a kind of trade thing between the Italian and South African publishers or African publishers who are focusing on children's books. And people were amazed at the quality of our books. But when they heard how we made them, they just wanted to, like, almost needed to sit down because it's so different and so magical and so surprising for many people that level of innovation came from Africa. There's a lot of ignorance about Africa in the Northern Hemisphere. And so it was such a proud moment. And everyone said, well, no, you need to show that here. So the following year, we pitched it to the organizers of the fair, and they covered all the costs to take 2 teams only. But thankfully, actually, it was so much work to organize. 2 teams of really top-notch book dashes. We split it over the 2 days, but we still kept to the 12 hours. So we did 6 hours one day and 6 hours the next day. And we made 2 beautiful, proudly African storybooks on the premises in the duration of the book fair, and then presented them on the 3rd day to people to see that it was real. And that was such a proud moment for me, not just for Book Dash, for kind of African publishing, for African innovation, for speaking back to the West, and showing that we know a thing or two. And the third one, I think it would probably be around funding. Book Dash is a nonprofit organization. We require donor funds to do what we do. We use them really responsibly and really effectively, I think. When a big funder comes on board and sees what you do and just says, here's millions and millions of rands, that is a moment that it's really hard to replicate, the affirmation and the kind of excitement of what we know that money is going to enable us to do. We've got a really number of loyal, wonderful funders, but Their World is a global kind of advocacy for ECD organization, and they also do grants. And 2 years ago, we won their Innovation in Early Education Award, and that came with a big grant and a lot of support for Scale Up. And it really felt so validating and exciting to be chosen and to be seen, and then be given a whole lot of resources that you can do wonderful stuff with. And it allowed us to hire 2 new people. Their World continues to fund printing of books so we can send them around the world.
Just fantastic. As we wrap up and as we look ahead, what is next for Julia Norrish?
I was thinking about this, and I obviously have been thinking about this for many months. And I think in so many ways, Bookdash kept me honest. I am like one of those people who want to do 100 million things all in one go and think that I'm going to fit it in on a Saturday. Bookdash has really been about 90% of my life and headspace for the last 8-9 years. So a bit of breathing space. I've got a spreadsheet with about 200 columns already, or rows of things I could do and many links. And so I've got to even just work through that. I was surprised at the last Bookdash with a gift of a team made a book that I didn't know about until the day. And it's kind of broadly about me, but not about my life story, just about how much I love books. And I thought it couldn't have been done more expertly, and I just really love books. And I think making sure that everyone in the world, no matter where they come from or who they are or what their life to date was, gets to experience that love of books and choose if they don't love books, that's fine, but not been able to make that choice is always going to define, I think, how I make decisions. I write, I paint, I want to at some point maybe illustrate a book. I have a love affair with France and the French kind of culture. So literary translation is something that I've really played around with. So improving my French would be a first start. But I can't see a world in which I'm not somehow working with increasing access to books and literature, whatever that looks like. I'm very bad at remembering quotations. The one that always sticks with me is Susan Sontag's love words, agonize over sentences, and pay attention to the world. I believe that the world's giving us glimpses all the time of where we should be going and what we should be doing. So I hope that next I have a bit of space to pay attention to what the next step is.
I am so envious of all the people who are going to get to work with you in the coming years. I hope I'm one of them. It's been an absolute joy talking to you today, Julia. Thank you so much for spending this time with me.
Thank you. It's been really brilliant to chat about why Bookdash is so amazing.
This episode was edited by Helen LaRue and researched by Emma Sacco. How Books Are Made is supported by Electric Bookworks, where we develop and design books for organizations around the world. You can find us online at electricbookworks.com.